Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you tonight as we continue our Bible study in the book of Exodus. And tonight we're going to focus on covering chapter 7, which will cover the first sign before Pharaoh and the first plague. And you can see on the screen over here that I have up what is commonly referred to as the 10 plagues of Egypt. And as we go through the next several chapters and discuss these plagues, we'll see that the word that they're actually most commonly called are signs. And so really, if we include the first sign with the other 10, you could actually call it the 11 signs. And what we're going to see is that these 11 signs follow a 1-9-1 pattern. And we can even break that down in greater detail as we will here in just a moment. But I want to back up before we get too far into this study, and I want to remind you of what we've seen going all the way back to chapter 5. In chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go in before Pharaoh. They're confident. They've come in the name of Yahweh, and they demand that Pharaoh allow the Israelites to go out in the wilderness so that they can worship the one true and living God. And they obviously had preconceived ideas on how easy that would happen and that Pharaoh would just comply and let them go. But we've seen that the plan didn't go as they thought. And matter of fact, it backfired because Pharaoh not only scoffed at the mention of Yahweh's name and their demand, but he retaliated by saying they have too much free time, too much idle time. And so he commissioned the Egyptian taskmasters to put pressure on the Hebrew foremen to continue making the bricks but gathering their own straw. Normally, the Egyptians would provide the straw that they would include in the brick to strengthen it. But because of the demand to be freed, Pharaoh said they'll get their own straw and their workload won't be diminished at all. Well, you can imagine how that went after a while. This group of excited Israelites who had their deliverers that had come and performed the signs that initiated an initial response of faith in their hearts, it was gone because of the injustice, the cruelty, the labor, the slavery that had been intensified. Things aren't going as planned. They haven't been set free. They're having to walk this thing out, and they've all lost faith. And not only did the Israelites lose faith, Moses and Aaron lost faith. In Moses, we can see at the end of chapter 5 there in verse 22, it says, Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why did you do evil to this people? Talk about shifting the blame, accusing God of doing evil because Pharaoh is the one who has a hard heart and won't let them go. And he goes on and says, why have you sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name. I want you to think about that phrase. Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all. And this is the same thing that we see in the New Testament. When you have the apostles who take the name of Jesus upon them, just like Jesus said, it led to a lot of things that they experienced that they didn't have planned. A lot of trouble, a lot of adversity, a lot of opposition. But it is something they had to press through, and it's something that they experienced because they were actually speaking on behalf of Christ in the New Testament, and here in the name of Yahweh, the one true and living God, the God of Israel. And so we can see that everybody is shaken in the Hebrew camp, the Hebrew people and their leaders, their deliverers. And so when we go into chapter 6, the response to that, it's like God doesn't even hear the accusation and the blame that Moses brought against him. He just proceeds into reminding him what his name is, that he is the creator, that he is the self-existent one, and that, essentially that's what his name means. He talks about how he's going to reveal his name in a greater magnitude than has ever been made known. And he's going to do that in Egypt. And so he reminds him of the covenant that he has made with Abraham, and he has promised to make his name known before Pharaoh and all of Egypt. And there in verse 9 it says, Moses spake so unto the children of Israel, but they hearkened not unto Moses for anguish of spirit and for cruel bondage. So they're not convinced, and so things aren't going as planned. And then it progresses, and you have verses 10 through 13 where God is telling Moses and Aaron to go back and confront Pharaoh again, and Moses starts in on these excuses again, right? And then you have the narrative that's interrupted, seemingly interrupted. This is abnormal for us in a modern culture, but it was a very normal thing in antiquity. You have the narrative interrupted with genealogy, which is not uncommon. We've seen that throughout Genesis as it framed the literary layout of the book of Genesis with the genealogy. So what was the purpose of the genealogy here in chapter 6? It was to focus on the validity of Aaron, because he was a partner with Moses in this deliverance process because of the concession of God to Moses complaining about not wanting to speak. And what's interesting about that is God allows Aaron to come alongside him. But we're going to, as we'll see, just pay attention as we go through the plagues and the interaction with Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. Moses does the overwhelming majority of the speaking anyway. So, he demanded this concession that God obliged, and there was really no point in it, and it's actually going to lead to trouble later on down the line, as we'll see, once they leave Egypt and arrive at Mount Sinai. But nonetheless, we see the genealogy that focuses on the priestly lineage through the sons of Aaron. And we'll see them come into play later on when they actually erect the tabernacle and start the priestly duties. But verse 28 of chapter 6, I believe that's where we left off, and that's where we're going to pick up, and then we'll focus on chapter 7. And it pretty much says the same thing that was said before the genealogy. And it came to pass on the day when the Lord spake unto Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I am Yahweh. Speak unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say unto you. And Moses said before Yahweh, Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips. How shall Pharaoh hearken unto me? So again, he continues to make these excuses. And that brings us to chapter number 7, where we're going to start picking up on some of the action that takes place. And it's going to be this way for a couple chapters. Well, for quite a while, actually. So let's jump into verse 1. And Yahweh said unto Moses, See, I have made you a god, or an Elohim, or as an Elohim, to Pharaoh. And the reason why it's said that way is because Pharaoh was kind of deified in Egypt, and he was associated with the gods of Egypt and viewed as such. And so when Moses comes and stands before Pharaoh, that's kind of how Pharaoh would see Moses, because Pharaoh represents the gods, the many gods of Egypt, and Moses is coming in the name of Yahweh, representing Yahweh, who he claims to be the sole self-existent creator God, who is above all beings and entities. And so Pharaoh's going to view him as, standing in the place of God, or speaking on behalf of God. And indeed he is. Now, Pharaoh's going to continually discredit this God and see him as being a rival to the gods that he worships. But we're going to see that God will prove to Pharaoh and all of Egypt that he is the God above all gods. And he's going to use creation reversal signs, wonders, and plagues to afflict the Egyptians until they ultimately allow the Hebrew people to go out into the wilderness. And so let's pick up in verse 1. And Aaron, your brother, shall be your prophet. So again, this concession has an added layer to what is said to be done, right? You have God who speaks to Moses, who speaks to Aaron, who speaks to everybody else. And again, we're going to see that Moses actually kind of steps into the leadership role that God originally called him to and expected him to step into, because again, he's going to do a majority of the speaking anyway. Verse 2, you shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. In verse 3 he says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, or literally in the Hebrew it's in a he feel causative verb, and I will cause to be hardened Pharaoh's heart. And he tells us in the latter part of that verse how. By multiplying my signs, my wonders in the land of Egypt. Now, a lot of people have struggled with what is said here in verse 3. The fact that God says himself that he will cause Pharaoh's heart to be hardened. And I honestly don't understand why people would have a hard time with God saying that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart, because we've already seen thus far in Exodus that Pharaoh's heart is already very hard. He has been oppressing the Israelites and continues to oppress them of his own accord. God has nothing to do with his desire to oppress and, enforce slavery on the Israelites. He is motivated by fear for the large majority as the reason why he is doing that. And so what God is going to do is respond to Pharaoh through these 11 signs, in particular what is commonly called the 10 plagues. And he is going to bring those judgments against Pharaoh, Egypt, and the Egyptians. And that is going to cause Pharaoh to respond by further hardening his heart, by becoming even more defiant and more strong-willed in his desire to release the Israelites. And so this is not God taking away Pharaoh's free will. This is not God taking over Pharaoh's will and causing Pharaoh to do certain things. This is a cause and effect. This is a response to response to response to response, back and forth, that we're going to see throughout these plagues. And so again, there's really no issue here in the fact that God is going to respond with judgments that are going to cause Pharaoh's heart to be even more hardened. We see this same thought recapitulated in the book of Revelation when it talks about the judgments that God is pouring out on the earth. Man still continues to be defiant and rebellious against God and fails to repent. Okay, so again, there is nothing God is doing here that is immoral in any way, shape, or form. Let's continue in verse 4. But Pharaoh shall not hearken or listen unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth my armies, which would be the Israelites, and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And so God is telling Moses again what he's already told him, that it's going to take a mighty hand of God himself through these judgments that will finally put Pharaoh in a position where he will release the Israelite slaves. Verse 5, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, which is kind of ironic because remember the initial response of Pharaoh when Moses and Aaron came and said they were speaking on behalf of Yahweh? His exact words, who is Yahweh? Well, Not only is he going to find out, but all the Egyptians will know who Yahweh is. And they're going to know, as we continue reading here, when I stretch forth my hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did as the Lord, or Yahweh, commanded them, so did they. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spake unto Pharaoh. And that's just kind of a narrative, conclusive statement there that we see common throughout the book of Genesis. If you remember in the Genesis series, at specific times throughout Genesis when significant events took place, it would state the name of, or the age of, like Abraham. You know, he was 90 years old when he circumcised himself, and and Ishmael was 13 when he circumcised him that same day. You know, it gives the age of Sarah and Abraham, the conception of Isaac, the birth of Isaac. And so prominent events are marked by giving the age of those whom God is using for his plan and his purpose. And so again, that shows a common authorship from Genesis to Exodus, which I've explained in the introduction of Genesis and Exodus, that I believe that Moses wrote the overwhelming majority of the Torah, and there was minimal editing that took place and some additions that also were inserted, but very minimally. Verse 8. And the Lord Yahweh spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, When Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, Show a miracle for you, then you shall say unto Aaron, Take your rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. What's interesting about that word there is, earlier we seen that when Moses was in the wilderness, God told him to throw his rod down, and it became a serpent. Okay, same English word, but it was a different Hebrew word. Then it was the Hebrew word nachash, which means a serpent. But here, I'm going to click on it, and you're going to see here that it's a different Hebrew word that's used 14 times in the Old Testament. And you can see each of the occurrences. Most of them are in prophetic or poetic type literature, as you can see here. But it's the Hebrew word tanin. And there's a lot of debate and division over how this word should be understood. But the common or the base lexical definition is a sea monster or a sea dragon. In other words, a reptile-like creature that comes from water. Okay? When you think of sea, don't think of like the saltwater sea, or don't limit that, any body of water. And when you break down this word and you look at the historical usage of this word in the Hebrew language, something that I've had the privilege of having access to a lot of history regarding, the word should most appropriately be interpreted or defined as crocodile, because a crocodile is a monster from the water. And it makes sense that being in Egypt on the Nile, I mean, if you've watched the Discovery Channel or National Geographic Channel, you know that there are a lot of crocodiles on the Nile. And so, whereas he was in the wilderness before, and you had a serpent before Pharaoh, the rod is going to become a crocodile. And we'll see that. So, verse 10. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh, before his servants, and it became a serpent. Well, that's what it says in English, but it's the Hebrew word tanin, which is crocodile. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Okay? He throws the rod down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it turns into a crocodile. I want you to envision this, okay? In verse 11, then Pharaoh also called the wise men and sorcerers, the magicians, diviners. Now the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. So through divination and powers that they were able to tap into, were able to duplicate the sign that Moses and Aaron was able to perform before Pharaoh. So they match power with power, or so it seems, right? Let's keep reading. Verse 12. For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents, or tanim. But watch what happens. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. That Hebrew word bala'ah is an interesting word, and when you look at how it's used in Exodus, it appears here as Aaron's rod. Just think about this. Aaron's rod turns into a crocodile. These magicians come in and throw theirs down, and theirs turn into crocodiles. But Aaron's rod / crocodile eats or swallows theirs. And again, it's interesting what word is used, because this is a word that is going to become a commonly used word associated with divine judgment. And so this is like a precursor to what is going to be said in Exodus 15 when it says that the Red Sea swallowed up Pharaoh's army. So right here in the first sign, you have a precursor to what's ultimately going to happen to Pharaoh's army. And so you kind of have a symbolic precursor of an event that's actually going to happen, where those aligned with Pharaoh are going to be judged by Yahweh. It's very interesting. We're going to see later on in Numbers that the earth swallows some people up that choose to rebel against Moses in the wilderness. And we'll get there probably in a year and a half from now. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. And as a response to Aaron's crocodile eating their crocodiles, and he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them as Yahweh had said. So Pharaoh, he's not impressed by it. He's put off. He's aggravated. He continues to strengthen, chazak, to strengthen his heart or his determination, his defiance, to not allow the Israelites to go. Okay? So the Hebrew word here, hardened, is chazak, which means to strengthen or to make strong. This is a pretty common verb in the Hebrew language. Verse 14, and Yahweh said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. But notice that it's translated hardened here, chazak, and then here it's translated in English hardened again. So you would naturally assume it's the same word in Hebrew, right? Because the same English word. Not so fast. This particular word it's heavy. It's the Hebrew word kaved, which you can see usually is translated as heavy or grievous, something heavy or weighty. And the only place, let's just click on it, in Exodus that it's used in this manner in relation to the condition of Pharaoh is right here. And so this is not the normal verb that is used to describe the hardening of Pharaoh. We can see it's right here Exodus 7:14 is the only place that it used this for the state of Pharaoh's heart. So his heart is heavy here in verse 14, whereas in verse 13 it was hardened. So it's hardened and it's heavy, and he refused to let the people go. So verse 15, he says, "Get thee up to Pharaoh in the morning. Lo, he goes out unto the water, and you shall stand by the river's brink against he come. And the rod which was turned to a serpent or a crocodile shall you take in your hand." It actually says nachash here, which is interesting. But this same rod has been turned into a nachash and a tanin. But he's going to confront him with what is commonly called the first plague. We're going to see that is the turning of the water into blood. Okay? We're going to actually read a couple excerpts from a couple commentaries, because there is some good information, and the way that they phrase it I thought was very informative, and I think everyone will appreciate it. So we'll look at that here in just a moment. He says, verse 16, "And you shall say unto him, Yahweh, Elohim of the Hebrews, has sent me unto you, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, until now you would not hear." Verse 17, "Thus says Yahweh." Have you noticed how much he's demanding the usage of his divine name? He is wanting to make sure they understand where these judgments are coming from, and he is going to make his name plainly known throughout all of Egypt. And we're going to see as they progress through the wilderness to the land of Canaan that everyone has heard about Yahweh and what Yahweh has done to the Egyptians. Verse 17, "Thus says Yahweh, in this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood." Now that phrase, "they shall be turned to blood," is, we don't need to press that just super literally. That doesn't mean it's going to turn into blood like we have in our bodies. And evidence that this is sometimes a euphemism for the color red. An example off the top of my head in Joel, where it says, the day of the Lord, the moon will be turned to what? Blood. Well, is the moon going to actually turn into blood? Of course not. We've experienced in recent years what is commonly called blood moons, which is when there's an eclipse where the moon has the appearance of being red. And this is what's going to happen to the water. And honestly, we don't know for sure how that manifests, what was the underlying factors. I'm going to show you some proposals of them being natural phenomenon here in just a moment. But I don't think that's a satisfying answer based on what we actually see the text say. So we'll read through that, and then we'll return to some of the things that are said as far as moderns wanting to try to explain everything as natural phenomenon and not supernatural miracles by the hand of God, like the text actually says. Instantaneous miracles, signs, the most common word. So, verse 17, "Thus says Yahweh, in this you shall know I am Yahweh. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river," or the Nile, "and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink. And the Egyptians shall loathe." That Hebrew word loathe there is actually a word that means to be weary of the water of the river. And of course, if it's full of dead fish and other dead animals, you'd be kind of leery or weary of drinking the water. And the Lord, or Yahweh, spoke to Moses, say unto Aaron, take your rod and stretch out your hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, this would be the tributaries, upon their rivers, upon their ponds, upon all their pools, mikveh, gathering together of water, which is one of the rare uses of the word mikveh, which echoes the gathering together of waters that we see described in the creation account. Again, this is going to be judgment against creation, a creation reversal, if you will, that Yahweh uses for his advantage. All their pools of water, that they may become blood or turned red. And that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in, notice vessels is italicized because it's not in the original. It literally says both in woods, and in stones. And it's really odd, honestly. It's very weird the way that it reads in the Hebrew, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's basically, I've seen proposals that it's the writer's way of trying to say that there was blood or this red throughout the whole land of Egypt. What we're going to see is that this affected the surface waters, water that was visible, because we're going to see the Egyptians, in response to this plague, are going to actually have to start trying to dig wells so that they can drink, because the plague's going to last 7 days. Verse 20, Moses and Aaron did so as Yahweh commanded, and he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, the river stank, the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Watch what happens here in verse 22. This is very interesting. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, which tells us that when Moses and Aaron performed this sign, that it didn't affect all of the water, or the magicians could not do it themselves, which again speaks against the possibility this is a natural phenomenon, because it's as if Moses and Aaron, bring forth this change in the water and different bodies of surface water, and it's visible, it's instant, and then the magicians do the same thing, and it's visible that they have the same power, or at least it appears that way. It could have given us more detail as far as I'm concerned, but they are able to, again, duplicate this sign. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened, which uses the most common word, chazak. Neither did he hearken or listen unto them as Yahweh had said. In verse 23, and Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither did he set his heart to do this also. And all the Egyptians dug round about the river for water to drink. Right? So all the surface water was affected. So they're trying to dig new wells or to dig down to where they can find water to drink. For they could not drink of the water of the Nile. And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. So this plague lasts for a week, and we all know that you can't survive a week without water. So they were scurrying around to try to find any sources of water that they could find. So again, primarily we see here that it's surface water that had been judged or contaminated, that had this red appearance, and they have to find other sources of water. Now, I want to do, since I figured we'd have plenty of time, I want to go to a couple of these commentaries and read some excerpts or some things that are said about the plagues, because there's some pretty good information here. This is the JPS Torah commentary. The JPS is the Jewish Publication Society that has their own translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into English. And it's not from a Christian perspective, it's from a Jewish perspective. And the purpose that these types of commentaries serve is they bring out a lot of things that are relative to the worldview, to the culture of the people of antiquity, and they don't try to impose they don't impose any New Testament ideas into their publications. It's strictly based on the ancient Near East and the Israelite customs and things like that. And it's a wealth of good knowledge, background knowledge, that sometimes is left out from some of the commentaries that are written from a Christian perspective, or trying to tie things in how they apply to our lives and things like that. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs here. It says, Pharaoh's intransigence, as foretold, sets off extraordinary chastisements mentioned in verse 4. These take the form of 10 disasters that strike Egypt in the course of a year. When I've kind of looked at it and kind of calculated these plagues, I don't have them lasting quite a year, but you could say a year and it not be a full year. I would lean more towards a process of a couple months in full. They are popularly known as the 10 plagues, in Hebrew, Aser Makot. And there's a lot, that's what's weird about this. There's a lot of different Hebrew words that are used for these plagues. There's the most common sign, Ot. There's Dever. There's Megefa. There's Mofit. There's several different Hebrew words that are used, and again, the most common one is sign, Ot. The Hebrew Bible features 3 accounts of the plagues. The longest and most detailed narrative is the prose version set forth in the ensuing chapters, which is obviously what we're in the middle of here. But in Psalm 78, verses 43 through 51, and Psalm 105, verses 27 through 36, present highly condensed poetic paraphrases. And we'll actually, once we go through all of these plagues, we'll actually go and cross-reference them and see how poetic portions use this story, because there are some differences, as we'll see here. They present highly condensed poetic paraphrases. The 3 sources vary in the sequence, number, and content of the plagues. Psalm 78 makes no mention of lice, boils, and darkness, whereas Psalm 105 ignores boils and pestilence due to the uncertain meaning of some of the Hebrew terms in those psalms. It is difficult to determine exactly how many and what kind of plagues the 2 compositions respectively present, nor can one establish with certainty whether the differences represent variant traditions or poetic license. And that's where I would lean towards, the poetic license. Poetry is not so much literal as makes use of poetic imagery, and it's not, you can't equate it on a one-to-one correspondence, because that's not how poetry functions. And we could spend a whole evening talking about Hebrew poetry and how it should be understood and interpreted. But let's keep reading. The present narrative is a sophisticated and symmetric literary structure. And this is where it gets interesting, and I'll actually show you a visual of this. The literary design and layout screams one author, and I'll show you why that is, and it'll explain some of it, I think, right here. With its sophisticated and some symmetric literary structure with a pattern of 3 groups, each comprising 3 plagues. And so you have the first 3 plagues, the second 3 plagues, and the third 3 plagues. So you have a triad of 3, right? And the last, or the 10th plague, is in a league of its own. It has several chapters that is given to it, that event alone, and that is the great deliverance. What's interesting is Revelation borrows that same pattern, triads. right? You have the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowl judgments. And included in a lot of those are the plagues that are borrowed from right here in this story. And so it's interesting to see the design and the literary features that are taking place. Okay, so the climactic 10th plague possesses a character all its own. The first 2 afflictions in each triad are forewarned. The last always strikes suddenly, unannounced. Furthermore, in the case of the 1st, 4th, and 7th plagues, which is the first one of each triad, Pharaoh is informed in the morning, and we just seen that. And Moses is told to station himself before the king, whereas in the second of each series, which would be the 2nd, the 5th, and the 8th plague, right? In the 2nd of each series, Moses is told to come in before Pharaoh, that is to confront him in the palace. Finally, in the first triad of plagues, it is always Aaron who's the effective agent. In the third, it is always Moses. And you have this strict pattern in each of these 3 triads. And again, we'll look at something that gives you a visual and makes it more visual so you can process it. The controlling purpose behind this literary architecture is to emphasize the idea that the 9 plagues are not random vicissitudes of nature. And I would agree with that assessment. Although they are natural disasters, they are deliberate and purposeful acts of divine will, their intent being retributive, coercive, and educative. I like the way they state that, because that's exactly as they are intended to function. As God's judgments on Egypt for the enslavement of the Israelites, they are meant to crush Pharaoh's resistance to their liberation. They are to demonstrate to Egypt the impotence of its gods, and by contrast, the incomparability of Yahweh, God of Israel, as the one supreme sovereign God of creation who uses phenomena of the natural order for his own purposes. In addition to this dominant motif in the plagues narrative, a secondary theme is also discernible. Israel, as well as the Egyptians, must know Yahweh. This is made explicit when we get to chapter 10, verse 2. The early Exodus narratives are very clear around the lack of the people's faith in its relationship with God. We've already seen them waver in faith already. In this regard, the mysterious silence of the Israelites throughout the course of the plagues may well be significant. True, the people is said to be shielded from the effects of the catastrophes, but only in the course of 5 of them. Nothing is said about this in connection with the others. It is only after the culminating miracle at the sea that the people feared Yahweh. They had faith in Yahweh and his servants. And we're going to see that didn't last very long, because by the time they get to Sinai, within a few months, I'm talking a few months, they're already worshiping a golden calf that they made with their own hands with the gold that was supposed to be for the furnishings of the tabernacle. And so they are a very fickle group of people, no doubt. Okay? Now, here is the New American Commentary, and this is kind of showing us what was kind of stated there, that you have these 3 triads. If you're looking at the screen, you can turn those on if you'd want. But you have a method of introduction, and we'll see that it's the same as we read in this particular story, that it's an outdoor morning confrontation with Pharaoh, and that is in the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th plague. In the 2nd, 5th, and 8th, which is the second one of each triad, you have an indoor court confrontation with Pharaoh. And then in the 3rd triad, you have an outdoor symbolic action, limited confrontation in each of those. And it's the same in all 3 of those scenarios. And so again, you have a purposeful literary design to where 1, 4, and 7, 2, 5, and 8, 3, 6, and 9 all follow the exact same details of how the plague is initiated and the interaction between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. And so it's very interesting, and we'll actually return to some of this and look at it as we progress through the plagues in time. Now, I want to show you a little excerpt here from the JPS Torah commentary on what we've seen in the first plague. This is not as long of a reading either, by the way, and I tried to increase the font. So this is talking about the waters becoming bloody or having the appearance of blood. This plague has been explained as the extreme. This is a supposed natural explanation. Has been explained as the extreme intensification of a well-known phenomenon that occurs periodically in the Nile Valley. The river is fed by melting snow and summer rains that pour down from the highlands of Ethiopia and carry with them sediment from the tropical red earth that characterizes the region. Following from this explanation, the plague must have resulted from an abnormally heavy rainfall that led to an excessively high rise of the Nile and washed down inordinate amounts of the red sediment. The neutralization of this substance, which normally occurs in the course of the flow of the river, was now retarded, so that the entire river took on a bloody hue. As a result, flagellates and purple bacteria washed down from the high mountain lakes, together with the particles of red earth, disturbed the oxygen balance and killed off the fish, which produced a foul stench. The Nile inundation, which reaches its height in September-October, has a bearing on the explanation for the next plague as well. I don't buy into that, because the narrative that we read makes it seem as it happens pretty rapidly, and there's no process of rain and floods and all that needed to bring to pass what God said he was going to do when he smote the waters with the rod, or stretched forth the rod towards the bodies of water. So I don't think we have to be able to explain what happened here, and we should allow the evidence of what the text actually says govern it. Now, obviously, God's working through nature in some ways to accomplish what he's doing, but it's not some process like we seen described here. Again, we'll see another version of this explanation here in just a moment. The Egyptians personified and deified the river Nile as the god Hapi, to whom offerings were made at the time of inundation. The flooding itself was regarded as a manifestation of the god Osiris. It is quite possible then that the contamination of the river served to discredit Egyptian polytheism. And I agree with that, because it's said that it's judgment against the Egyptian gods and all of Egypt. And so, yeah, I'm on board with that. Also, by commencing the series of plagues with the striking of the Nile waters, the text suggests an underlying notion of retribution, measure for measure, for Pharaoh's iniquitous decree that all newborn males be cast into the river. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, because the first plague and the 10th plague are both retribution for what the Egyptians and what Pharaoh has done against the Hebrew. Because what was the method of death that was used for the Hebrew babies back in chapter 1? Throw them in the Nile. So here we see in the first plague, God is judging the source of death that was used against the Hebrew babies. And it happens to be the Nile, which is the source of life for Egypt, becomes an instrument of death. And not only that, because it's personified and deified, it is a judgment against the Egyptian gods, which were again an instrument of death against Hebrew babies, which are being judged here. And then in the 10th plague, we see that God judges the firstborn of all of Egypt, even the animals. So definitely connection between the first and the 10th, and that they are retribution against the sins of Egypt and Pharaoh and his heinous decrees to kill the male Hebrew children. Okay? Let's look at this excursus. Were the plagues merely natural events? And this is taken from the New American Commentary, Stuart Douglas. I really have enjoyed this commentary as much as any of them, of the 7 that I've been reading through as we went through the series. And he presents what is presented by a female scholar by the last name Hort. And we're going to kind of read through this, and we're going to read through we'll read the first plague at least, and we'll return to this as we look at each plague and look at the natural phenomena reasoning behind each plague, as if they all have to be explained as being natural phenomena. So let's read. A widely held understanding of the plagues must also be addressed here. The view that the plagues are natural ecological events. This view, most eloquently espoused and documented by G. Hort, has gained favor in many circles and seemingly has much to commend it, even though this author is going to disagree with it, and I'll disagree with it as well. I like how they will present evidence that other scholars have done work on, even though they don't agree with it. And they'll explain why as we'll continue to read. We will summarize it here, but address some of its particulars in connection with the commentary on the various plagues. Hort argues that the plagues are, in fact, all natural phenomena, occurring in the order that such phenomena would occur in nature, with some of the plagues being the result of well-known periodic or seasonal Egyptian phenomena, and some being the result of immediately prior plagues, with anthrax figuring prominently in several. And the following schema summarizes her approach. And so this is what is said about the first plague, which is the Nile becoming blood. The cause, unusually heavy rainfall in the upper Nile headwaters, kind of like what we've seen described a while ago in the JPS commentary. And the effect, the flood dissolves and brings red dirt characteristic of the Abyssinian and Ethiopian plateau in the headwaters of the Blue Nile all the way into Lower Egypt. Added to the reddish color of the dirt is the reddish color of certain microorganisms known as flagellates, which are always present in the Nile, but because the flooding and the nutrients brought with it, which multiply in abundance, making the Nile red in color, undrinkable, and poison to the fish. Now again, that seems like an extra time-consuming process, and that really isn't indicated in what we just read. Now, we'll return to those in time, but let's continue on this. Thus, according to Hort's thesis, the plagues were all natural phenomena that could and did otherwise occur in Egypt, but were extremely harsh just prior to the Exodus due to extraordinary rainfall at the headwaters of the Nile and resultant environmental biological effects. Hort's thesis still leaves many questions unanswered, which she simply does not address in any detail. These include the following questions, which may roughly describe in rhetorical fashion the range of views relative to whether or not the plagues were real historical events. Number 1, were the plagues merely natural phenomena later embellished by tradition and attributed by storytellers to supernatural power summoned by the actions of Moses and Aaron? A lot of people actually believe that. Number 2, were the plagues natural phenomena that God foresaw and then gave Moses and Aaron instructions on how to be seen as summoning them by various symbolic actions? That would be to undermine the character of what we just read, so you can just chunk that out the window. That's about half insulting to what we just read. Number 3, were the plagues natural phenomena brought about fully by supernatural means and timed directly by God? God initiated all the plagues as natural phenomena under his control and put them in a time sequence also under his control. I don't have a problem with that one. Number 4, were the plagues genuine miracles intended to replicate in extreme fashion natural phenomena that can and do occur in Egypt so as to demonstrate that God controlled both the environment and the gods the Egyptians thought produced the environment, and that God could do with them whatever he wills. And that's more plausible, certainly, than the first ones that were mentioned. Then he says, Bush cogently summarizes the weakness. And so this is another author or scholar responding to Hort. Summarizes the weaknesses of Hort's thesis as follows. The biblical account describes the plagues as the result of commands given by Moses and Aaron as commencing instantaneously by a gesture rather than coming gradually with seasons. Point well taken, because that's what we just read. Example, the Nile turned to blood in the presence of Pharaoh, according to chapter 7 verse 20, and ashes thrown into the air before Pharaoh produced skin sores, according to chapter 9 and verse 10, as we'll see. The extremity of the plagues goes beyond what mere flooding of the Nile, no matter how unprecedented, would justify. The frogs covered the land, according to 8 and verse 6. The very dust of the ground turns into biting insects, according to chapter 8 and verse 17. So I like how this scholar is coming against the other scholar's thesis or proposal with what the text actually says. At some point, you just got to let the text be the text and quit trying to assume we're going to be able to explain exactly in detail how everything happened that we find recorded in the Bible. Moreover, since the Egyptian magicians could and did duplicate the phenomena of the first two plagues of blood and frogs, they obviously were reacting to what they and Pharaoh perceived as magic on the part of Moses and Aaron, not some gradually occurring environmental phenomenon already well known to them as natives of Egypt. Another great point. In other words, if native Egyptian magicians could tell that the plagues were not natural phenomena, why should moderns, a millennium and a half later, try to overrule the opinion of observers on site at the time? Slam dunk right there. To Bush's summary of weaknesses in Hort's approach, one might add that the magicians saw the third irreproducible plague as the finger of God. And we'll see that they actually say that. We can't duplicate it. It is the finger of God. Rather than as something that normally happens in Egypt, even if on a lesser scale. Moreover, their ability to duplicate the plagues failed completely thereafter, and they gave up trying to duplicate what obviously was something beyond their experience. Additionally, Pharaoh's reactions to each plague suggest genuine surprise and dismay, hardly likely if the plagues were merely normal environmental phenomena experienced to a severe degree. Further, the plagues differentially affected the Egyptians but left the Israelites unscathed, so that natural phenomena were respecting political ethnic boundaries. That's another great point. Something hardly explained by recourse to the outworkings of mere natural processes. So it's speaking of them being protected in Goshen, as we'll see later on. Perhaps most significantly, the final plague, that of the death of the firstborn, has no natural explanation at all. It was a special judgment of God. How could any natural disease strike only firstborn children and not harm others? Great points. And it is so obviously so that because of it, Pharaoh insisted on the exodus of the Israelites in sudden and direct contrast to the determined prior policy not to let them go. So the view that best takes account of all the data may be summarized as follows. The first 9 plagues were special, divinely produced manifestations of God's sovereignty over Egypt, its king, its people, its environment, its gods, accomplished by imitations on a huge and destructive scale of phenomena thought by the Egyptians to be the province of their gods. God turned things believed to be specialty of the gods of Egypt against the Egyptians. And this is what is beautiful about this whole story of these plagues. And showed himself in control of all events and powers they would have attributed to the objects of their faith. The 10th plague, on the other hand, was in no way a magnified imitation of a natural phenomenon, but stood apart from the first 9 as a decisive imposition of the death penalty on the nation that tried to enslave and mortally oppress God's special people, his firstborn. And so we see here in this response by Bush and Douglas here that the natural phenomena proposals of Hort are just unattainable when you actually look at what the text itself says. And so I hope you have found our study thus far beneficial and enlightening. I hope you've learned something. We'll continue to return to some of these ideas that we've covered here, and we'll return to each of these plagues and see what is said about each of them as far as being natural phenomena. But again, as we've just read, that's hardly what we see in the evidence of what the text actually says. And again, our goal, as always here at the well, is to let the text be the text and try to interpret it responsibly in its context and let the text speak for itself. So that's it for tonight. 1 hour on the dot. I hope everyone's doing well, and hopefully we can be together again soon, even though I'm kind of getting used to talking to a screen at this point. So anyway, until we meet again, I hope everyone's well. If you have any needs, let us know. Love you guys. Bye.